He's a neurologist at Yale New Haven. At Yale New Haven Hospital, thank you, Mark, and is the founder of the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, and everyone knows Dr. Stephen Novella. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone for coming here. Excited to get started with DragonCon. I think I've been coming here for about 10 years, something like that, to DragonCon. It's always a lot of fun. You may notice that none of my fellow rogues are in the audience. Kara is in Africa, so she has an excuse. I figured it'd be a little bit too far for her to come. Evan is actually on another panel. Evan has another podcast where he reviews board games, and so he and his people are running 4 panels on board games. And then Jay and Bob thought that they would be more interested in seeing a panel on the return of City of Heroes. So that's where they are.
Where's that?
Too late, you're stuck. So I wanted to talk about, this was, I think, listed as Skepticism 101, but that could encompass a lot of things. I'm going to talk about skepticism as a movement. We will talk about what that means, what skepticism is, but we're going to talk about skepticism as a movement. So modern skepticism, the modern skeptical movement, so this has to be distinguished from philosophical skepticism, which goes back centuries. Modern skeptical movement, so there was the organization that gets the credit for being the first modern skeptical movement was the Committee Paranormal, founded in Belgium in 1949. They're still running. So they are the oldest running skeptical organization. But they were pretty much the only organization for a while. Then in 1976, it took almost 30 years, SciCop was founded by Paul Kurtz and Marcello Truzzi. Paul Kurtz was a professor of philosophy in Amherst, and definitely gave an academic and philosophical bent to modern skepticism, which I think was very important in terms of establishing it as an actual movement in the modern times. There we go. So then, Ray Hyman, James Randi, and Martin Gardner need to be given a lot of credit for the formation of SciCop, even though it was ostensibly created by Paul Kurtz and Marcello Truzzi. So those three guys got together at one point and said, we need a skeptical movement. We need an organization that's going to defend science and investigate paranormal claims, et cetera. But none of them really had the organizational and academic connections to do it at that time. So they looped in Paul Kurtz to do it. But it was really their idea. And now there are hundreds of skeptical organizations around the world. There's somewhere between, depending on how you count them up, 50 to 60 in the United States. There's another 100 or so in different countries. They go by various names. They may use skepticism in the title. Free thought is very common, rationalist, humanist, science and reason. They might book themselves as an investigating organization. There's also the Good Thinking Society in the UK, which is the only one I think that uses that particular phrase. But there may be some other very closely related phrases. That's basically the terms that you're going to run across. If you count all of them up, it's literally hundreds of organizations. So what are they doing? Oh, I'm not. There we go. So what is our mission? What is it that we're trying to do? We're obviously trying to change the world, right? We're trying to make the world a better, more skeptical, more critically thinking place. And if you ask most skeptics, what is it that you do? What is it? What is the goal of the skeptical movement? How are we going to fix the world? The number one answer is education. That's always the first and foremost. And I do believe that is the single most important thing that we do, is education. It's not just educating the public, it's educating educators, it's educating the media, journalists, all academics, regulators, people who are in the government, people who have control over your lives. And it's educating them on a particular set of, as they say in that movie, I have a very particular set of skills, right? So the skeptics have a very particular set of skills that really crosses over a lot of different disciplines, and no other discipline kind of brings everything together that skeptics bring together. And I'll get to that more in a moment. But we like to educate people, make them more critical thinking, more scientific literacy, a greater understanding of self-deception, of psychology as it applies to why people believe what they believe. We may also do investigations. My organization has done a number of investigations I've been doing this now for 23 years. The Connecticut Skeptical Society was formed in 1996. And we did a lot of local investigations, UFOs, other paranormal claims, psychics, a lot of ghosts. If you do paranormal hunting in Connecticut, it's a lot of ghosts. Every region sort of has the thing that is their specialty. And in New England, it's definitely ghosts. Not the least of which because that's the home of Ed and Lorraine Warren, until they're both now passed, but Ed and Lorraine Warren basically made ghost hunting a thing. And they lived not too far from us in Connecticut, and that was one of our first investigations, actually, was hitting them up saying, hey, show us your best evidence. They didn't really have any. Then also promotion of a skeptical worldview. So it's not just that we believe in science and critical thinking. There's a lot more to it than that. We actually value those things more than perhaps other things. We value the process over the belief. We value believing things that are more likely to be true over believing things that are maybe more comforting or more ideologically compatible. So it is an approach to how we think and how we believe. Consumer protection is huge. We heard a lot about that on the previous panel. There is a lot of fraud in the world. And there is surprisingly little protection for the public in general against that fraud. That fraud takes a lot of forms. Most people, I think, naively assume, and I say this because there are surveys which show this, and if you ask people, and I've been doing this for 23 years, you ask people, what they think about it, and especially if you focus on this very specific thing, like, do you think a company could get away with this? And most people would think, oh no, the government would keep them from doing it. No, the government actually doesn't keep them from doing that. They could pretty much do whatever they want, and we definitely live in a buyer beware world. We heard about that with the psychic scams on the previous panel, right? Even the police are like, it's not our job to protect you from your own stupidity. Actually, it is. But you're not doing your job, and that's generally the case. So we fill that gap, right? So we see our movement as being protecting consumers from fraud and deception through education, but also through other means as well, which we'll get to. And along those lines, we like to expose fraud, expose pseudoscience for what it is, expose quackery, anti-science, charlatanism, choose your word, but to expose things that are not science but are pretending to be, to expose things that are diminishing the role of science in the world, or the legitimacy, the validity of science. Develop scientific skepticism as an intellectual discipline. Now, this is one that doesn't get, I think, as much attention as it should within the skeptical movement. I'm going to describe for you what I think that is, so we're going to linger on this item for a bit. What is scientific skepticism, and what is it as an intellectual discipline? And as an intellectual discipline, I also mean an academic discipline, which has actually been the hardest thing to do, establishing a new academic discipline. It exists in piecemeal. But again, it's very rare for anyone to bring it all together. So scientific skepticism, has multiple parts. One part is scientific literacy. That's, I think, I think that's probably the core piece historically. Meaning, if you 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly in 1976, when SciCop was forming, you ask what's the main goal of skepticism, and it was to promote scientific literacy and to investigate pseudoscience. It was all about scientific literacy. I often point out that Carl Sagan, who is, again, one of the intellectual founders of modern skepticism, he had that model, that he articulated very eloquently, as he did everything, what we now call the knowledge deficit model. People believe pseudoscience in exact proportion that they misunderstand science. Very Sagan-esque, very pithy, also very wrong. But we only know that because it's 20 years later, and we've done 20 years of research, and collectively. And we know that that's only a piece of the puzzle, and it may be the lesser piece. That people actually do not, there isn't a linear correlation between scientific literacy and belief in pseudoscience. In fact, interestingly, belief in pseudoscience increases with education until you get to postgraduate level of science education. So unless you are beyond college in a science field, your level, population-wise, obviously skeptics, I think, are a different subpopulation, but if you're in the general population and just statistically, people actually will tend to endorse more paranormal and pseudoscientific beliefs at higher education levels. So there isn't this one-to-one correlation. And we also know now from a host of psychological research, which has really taken off in the last 5 to 6 years, which is great, with the whole fake news thing. There's been a lot of legitimate psychological interest in doing research on, well, why do people form their beliefs and how do we change them? So if you take somebody who has a belief that is pseudoscientific and you give them facts, you fix their knowledge deficit, do they change their belief? The answer is, it's not no, it's sometimes. So sometimes skeptics oversimplify the research. There's a lot of nuance in the research. The short answer is no-ish, but it's sometimes. They will fix their false belief if they have no emotional investment in the conclusion. But as their emotional investment in the conclusion increases, their response to facts decreases. So it depends on the topic for that individual person. And at the extreme end, it may, in fact, cause a backfire effect, but that has not been clearly established in the literature. There's conflicting results in the research. But it certainly is problematic, the more people are invested in the outcome. So what does that mean as a movement? So we're trying to change people's minds, right? And the good old-fashioned Sagan knowledge deficit approach mostly doesn't work for most of the things that we're interested in, because people do have emotional investment in most of the topics that we're addressing. We're not telling them something of no consequence about history or whatever, where people just easily incorporate new information. So, and I think that's where it feels like the answer is no to us, because it is no for most of the things that we deal with, right? But not across the board. So now what do we do? Are we stuck? It's like, no. The good news is that with that knowledge that the belief in pseudoscience is not just a knowledge deficit problem, is also knowledge about what kind of problem it is. People believe what they believe for a number of reasons, but when it comes to religious beliefs or ideological beliefs or pseudoscientific beliefs, largely they believe it because it's part of a narrative that they use to understand the world, to have a sense of control over their world, their environment, to have a sense of meaning in terms of their own existence, right? And also to give them a connection and a source of identity. So people use narratives to establish identity, which can, in its worst manifestation, could be very tribal. They do it to feel like a sense of meaning, to feel like they have some kind of control, and to just understand the world. And what the research shows is you have to understand what that narrative is in order to alter it. You're not just changing information or changing a belief. You have to take from somebody something that's very precious to them, a narrative they're using to understand the world. And in order to do that successfully, because if you just try to yank it away from them, they're going to clutch it tighter to themselves. So what you have to do is give them an alternate narrative, right? I like to make an analogy to that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know how when he's trying to replace the idol with the sandbag, and he's got to flip in one and take out the other. You have to kind of do that with people. You have to, At the same time that you're taking away one belief, you have to replace it with another narrative, an alternate narrative, another way to make sense of all the information that's out there. Because oftentimes, they have the information. Not always. Topics, it's different for each topic. But sometimes, they know all the information. They just have an alternate narrative by which they're making sense of that information. You have to then take that narrative away and replace it with a scientific skeptical narrative, one that puts it into more of a realistic, more critical thinking, more internally valid context, right? That's as tricky as it sounds. That is as hard as it sounds. There is no easy way to completely wrap your head around someone's narrative, which is woven in with other narratives, which is woven in with their culture and identity, and then figure out some way to replace that with your narrative, basically, which is a scientific skeptical narrative. But that is really, I think now the skeptical movement understands what we're up against better than we did 20 years ago. Because it's not just a knowledge deficit anymore. It is, we are confronting altering world views. Nothing has brought that home to me more in the last couple of years than the flat earth movement. Because I honestly, this is as much as jaded a skeptic as I am, and they don't come more jaded than me. I was surprised that people were able to get to a place cognitively where they actually think the freaking world is flat. And even today, when I say this to my fellow skeptics, the most common response I get is, yeah, but they don't really believe that, right? No, they fucking believe it for real. I know I have people in my life close to me that are flat earthers. I could tell you 100% they believe it for real. How does that happen? How does somebody get to the point where they're willing to throw out all of physics, right, and embrace a conspiracy theory that's absurd on multiple levels that you can disprove by walking outside? I mean, seriously, think about it. We laugh because it causes cognitive dissonance to try to think about it. How could somebody believe this? But that's been part of my personal evolution as a skeptic, is trying to understand the full breadth of how people deceive themselves. If you can understand fully how somebody could be a flat earther, then you get a lot. You get a lot of what we confront as a skeptic. And you also understand what we're up against. And so now the challenge is to try to figure out, how do we walk somebody back from being that far into the abyss, of self-deception? And it's not easy. And there's certainly, it's not going to happen in one conversation. I'll tell you, so if I were naive about anything 23 years ago, that was it, where I thought, well, evolution is true, and I'm pretty knowledgeable about the science behind evolution, and if I had an hour to sit down with a creationist and explain to them all the evidence for evolution and point out to them all, thank you, Richard, all of the, Richard promised to heckle me during my talk today, all of the logical fallacies in their pseudoscience, of creationism, that how could I not convince them that evolution is true? And I had to learn the hard way. It's like, no, you can't. You can't convince somebody in a single conversation, because it's not a knowledge deficit problem. They have their whole worldview wrapped up in this, and disentangling that Gordian knot of beliefs is a long project for any individual person. Okay. Skeptics also serve as institutional memory. And what does that mean? So, the worst thing about a zombie apocalypse, you knew I had to bring that up at some point during this talk, is, and I'm going to plug our Doomsday panel, which is happening later, right? Is that 5:30? We'll talk about this. When you have the worst thing about an apocalypse, where 95 or 99% of the population dies, is that's the death of all institutional memory, right? You may think that human knowledge exists in databases and books and on the internet, but no, it doesn't. It exists in institutional and cultural memory among experts in a particular field. And skeptics are experts in a particular field, and we have institutional memory, and that would be lost like everything else. So what does that institutional memory consist of? Well, it's lots of little things, like knowing that 200 years ago, there was a fad about magnetic healing. And so when somebody says, oh, I have this magnetic bracelet that's going to heal you, it's like, that was debunked literally 200 years ago. But who knows that? Only skeptics know that, because nobody else cares, right? But when things come around again, we're like the B cells in the immune system, right? You remember B cells, there's something called memory B cells. You get exposed to something, you make antibodies, but then the memory B cells remember that thing, and then the next time you get exposed, they just immediately pour out all the antibodies, and that's why you don't get infected a second time. We're the memory B cells for pseudoscience, right? When the thing comes around again, we're like, no, we've seen this before. We auto-debunk it, right? Like, here's the information, here's the context, here's the history. It's like, this guy is still a fraud, whatever. That's institutional memory, because this is what we know, this is what we investigate, this is what we care about. There's no other place that institutional memory exists except the skeptical movement. So that's a very, very important function that we serve. Okay, but we're also activists, right? Skeptics are activists. We're trying to not just change ourselves, which is always a good place to start, but we're also trying to change the world. So what are the kinds of things that we do? So we form groups, right? We form groups at the national level, at a local level, at a regional level, virtual groups online now, and we organize, we lecture to each other, we talk to each other. Humans are social creatures, where that's just the way it is, and we function optimally when we are networking as a community, and that's what we do. We are a resource to media and also to professionals, which includes professionals is everything. The government, academics, researchers, journalists, everything. That's probably the thing that I individually do the most, is I get probably 3 or 4 contacts a week from somebody, the media, or somebody doing research, or whatever. And that's a really important service that we provide, as being an identifiable person who's a contact for the media, who has an area of expertise. Because I could put a topic into context for a journalist in a 10-minute conversation that they never would have ever gotten to. Even if they did, they do their week or 2 weeks or month of investigative journalism on a topic, they would never get the context that I could give them in 10 minutes. Because this is a topic that I've wrapped my head around over 20 years, right? And that the nitty gritty, the arguments, the counter arguments, the evidence, why that evidence is not valid, etc. And so being able to tee that up for a journalist doesn't mean that the report's going to come out the way you want it to, but it is a massively useful service that we can provide. We do lots of publications. One of the first things we did, as our local skeptic group 23 years ago, was we published a newsletter on print. Can you imagine? We would go to the printer with our copy. They would turn out 200, 300 copies that we would physically mail to people and distribute. It was crazy times. But we also publish books. Some of us publish magazines and journals, sometimes scientific journals. So there's a lot of publications, and now, of course, a lot of this has gone online. So when social media hit, we jumped in with both feet, because who the hell wants to print a newsletter? So we were able to do, for a lot less work, we were able to go from reaching hundreds of people to reaching thousands of people, and now hundreds of thousands of people, and even millions of people. So I like to brag about the fact that our Facebook page has over 1 million followers. So that is unachievable without social media. And social media absolutely transformed the skeptical movement. And as somebody who lived through that, I was a skeptical activist before social media and after social media, and through that transformation, completely transformed the skeptical movement. Starting with blogs, rapidly progressing to podcasts. And now, apparently, we have to be on Instagram, and that's hard to keep up. There's so many different social media platforms that, if you want to stay relevant, you have to at least know what it is. You have to tweet, and you have to have a Facebook page. It's like a requirement now. If you are doing social activism, you have to be social media savvy. The people who are doing it well, honestly, are hiring social media experts to do it for them. And a lot more people are doing that than you probably think. I haven't done that. I've sort of done that. Jay's my social media expert, and I have hired him. But we actually had a legit social media expert volunteer for us for a year and completely transformed what we were doing in terms of social media. There is genuine expertise to be had there. But anyway, what that changed the skeptical movement in a number of ways. One big way was it completely changed the demographics. We went from being a social group that was 90% old white guys, and I'm saying this as an old white guy, and Richard will sympathize with me in this, but yes, it was, you go to the meetings, and it was mostly old white guys, and occasionally they'd bring their wife, and that was it. And that after social media, the demographics slowly shifted younger and younger and younger, and more gender balanced and more racially balanced, although that's still a huge challenge for the skeptical movement, as we do not nearly reflect the racial balance of the public at large, which is a problem that we have not yet cracked, a cultural thing that we just don't understand. But it's much better than it was, much better than it was, and it's great to go to meetings and to publish a podcast. Like, the average age of our listener is way younger than any skeptical organization ever achieved. I love getting emailed by 15-year-old people who have been now listening to the show their entire life, which is scary. So it's true. We have a 13-year-old, adorable, by the way, publisher of skeptical children's books. That's the kind of thing that happens when you have a vibrant movement that exists online. You can't really do that. Now, social media is a two-edged sword, right? It's also made it a lot easier to spread misinformation, quackery, to sell your nonsense, and so our challenges have also increased exponentially. Our ability to deal with them has increased exponentially, and the challenges have risen simultaneously. So we're running to stay in place, I think, as a movement, but we have to do it, and that's okay in a way. We're never going to fix the world, right? That's early on, I had a couple of people who worked with us who really thought they were going to fix the world within years. I'm like, no, it's not going to happen. We're just going to do this until we die, and the world's going to be pretty much the same as it was now. It just won't be worse, right? If we could just keep it from getting worse, then probably we've spent our career usefully. And I feel like that's basically what we've been doing, and that's not a negative thing. When you think about what we're up against, I'll tell you what we're up against. Let me give you a quick overview of what we're up against. We're up against thousands of well-funded organizations that have to focus on one thing. And we're trying to combat all of them, and we're not well-funded. We're smaller, we're pluckier, though. We have a lot of energy and a lot of passion and enthusiasm, and we have, I think, our strongest asset, we're right. And that helps a lot. It helps a lot. We follow a valid process, and the facts, the logic, the evidence are on our side. By definition, that's what we're promoting, right? So that's almost by definition, that's the case. And we're very self-skeptical, and we're willing to change our beliefs. We adapt to the evidence. You can never be right forever. You can only be right for now, and then the evidence changes, and then either you adapt to the evidence or you become progressively wrong. So everyone out there who's locked into their belief system is becoming progressively wrong, and we're adapting to the evidence because we follow a process, right? We follow not a conclusion, not a belief. And so that's a huge advantage. I could change what I believe when the evidence changes because I believe whatever the evidence says at any given moment, and that's a moving target. So we're nimble when it comes to that. And I think we've gotten very good at communication skills. And I think that people who are good at communication have sort of, social media is good this way too. Social media allows, I think, certain qualities to rise to the top. If you're good at communicating, I think you will thrive on social media. Unfortunately, it also allows people who are good at self-promoting to thrive. And so even if you don't have a good message or you're not correct, you can exploit it for self-promotion. You know, like Mike Adams, the health ranger, is a good example. The guy's full of shit from beginning to end, but has a multi-million-dollar online social media empire because he's really good at selling bullshit, and so that exists as well. So that's what we're up against. We're up against a lot of, you know, again, people who they're well-funded and they have a huge financial incentive. So you know, I write an article about someone saying that the claims this guy's making is wrong, here's why they're wrong. To me, that's one of thousands of topics I'm writing about. To that guy, I just attacked his livelihood, his one source of livelihood. It may be a fraudulent source of livelihood, but that's what I just did. And the higher profile we get, which is I think a good thing, I think as the skeptical movement's profile has risen, and I've also experienced this, I went for 20 years without no one even threatening to sue me, and I've been sued 3 times in the last few years, or now it's like 5 years. That's just the nature of reality for being a skeptical activist, because as our profile goes up and as we actually start landing really good blows against charlatans, that's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to do. So we're reorganizing around that as well. We're actually putting together with Iran, you know, from Australia and others, a Skeptics Legal Defense Fund, because that's the kind of thing you got to do today in order to survive. But we're doing it. We're adapting, right? We're adaptive. We're nimble. Okay, we have meetings and conferences like DragonCon, and I think there's no coincidence that DragonCon has a Skeptics track. It's got a podcasting track, a science track, and a Skeptics track. It also has a paranormal track, but that's okay. We used to debate them. Who was here like 10 years ago when we used to debate them, and then they just stopped, you know, because it never went well for them, you know. But anyway. Yeah, right, yeah. I want to do it, so I love debating. I'd do it some more. So meetings and conferences are a great way to network, to socialize. Again, the absolute number of people is not a lot compared to social media, but you get the most passionate members, which are hugely important to any movement. And also, it's great outreach. You know, I love coming to DragonCon because it has 2 things. It has a reasonably sized group of very passionate skeptics, and it's got 80,000 nerds who don't know about skepticism, and hopefully we could loop some of them in, you know, by being here. We do some investigative journalism. I'd like to see more of this. You know, I think if we're balancing what is the skeptical movement doing and what should we be doing, that's the kind of thing where I think that, yeah, we do some of that, but we don't do as much as we should. So partly we help investigative journalists do it, which is great, and that's probably the most effective use of our time. As I said, in 10 minutes with an investigative journalist, I could fix their story if they'll listen to me. But for me to do that investigative journalism, I'd have to quit my day job, right? So until we have more people doing this full time, there's still very few of us doing this full time. Like Joe Nichols really still the only sort of full time who doesn't have a day job, you know, paranormal investigator that I know of. But there's a few of us, you know, who are trying to do it sort of full time, but it's really hard. Most of us have day jobs. As you may have noticed, not a lot of money in skepticism. It's all on the other side. But I would like to see skeptics become investigative journalists as their day job. Chris Mooney has done that. So Chris Mooney is an author and a journalist who's a skeptic. And that's how we started out. We need more of them. And I'd like to see more investigative journalists become skeptical, right? That's our job, is to teach them how to become more skeptical. But we need that. We need investigative journalism, absolutely, more now than ever, right? And this is another trend that's been disturbing that's happened over my skeptical career, is that I think the baseline quality of journalism has steadily declined. And that's empirical. That's not just my perspective, but it does fit with my personal experience. Some of you may have experienced that as well. And there's a reason for it. And the reason is social media. And what happened was the business model of newspapers, of journalism, essentially collapsed. And they had to find a new way to do it. And they have. They've adapted. But part of adapting, you know, embracing social media and surviving in the new world, part of that was consolidation. And what consolidation meant was that there's no longer necessarily a science editor, even at big newspapers. They have a general editor and generalist reporters. So science journalism has contracted. There just wasn't a market for it. And so we see a lot of science by press release. which is, just, here's a press release talking about a science story. They just literally republish it word for word. That's a lot of what science journalism has become, because it's cheap and easy. You could literally have a computer do it by algorithm. It doesn't even require the intervention of an actual journalist. And then when a journalist does get involved, it is often not much better. Or their sole involvement is writing a horrific headline that might even completely reverse the actual findings of the study. Forget about nuance. But again, that is a great role for skeptics. And a lot of what those of us who are writers do, like bloggers, I think we're the skeptical blogging, the primary thing that we do is fix bad journalism. We see a news story, they get it wrong, we say, here's the actual story, and then we tell what's really going on. And sometimes, this happens frequently, which is good. The journalists contact you and say, all right, tell me how to get this story right now. Because they don't like being eviscerated by a scientist who's telling them that they got their story wrong. They'd like to just get the story wrong and move on to the next story, But when you tell them, no, you totally screwed that up, they may pay attention to you. They may notice. So that happens. So that's good. That's the thing, that we sort of just automatically filled that role. That was something I think that we were pretty ahead of the curve. There are not many things where I think we were ahead of the curve. We're often reacting to what's happening out there in the world, like fluctuating volume levels and things like that. But this was one where I thought we were really ahead of the curve, and skeptical science journalists were there and really solidified a place. And many of the top science blogs still are basically skeptical. Like Bad Astronomy is a great one, for example. So we kind of carved out that territory for ourselves, and it's been working out extremely well. And now there are a lot of specialty, because if you're going to have your audio levels fluctuating, the light levels have to go along with it as well. Now we have a lot of specialty ones, like Science-Based Medicine is a medicine blog that's very, very skeptical, and fills a critical role, in my opinion, even though I founded it. But it does. I mean, we get contacted by journalists all the time. We've been asked to give testimony to the NIH, to the FTC, to the FDA. So it's not just, and also to academia, to the USDA. So we've been filling a very, very critical role there. So I think skeptical activism has been doing quite well, actually. I think we could be generally positive about the role that we've been filling in the world. And I think at least we could say it would be a lot worse without us. Again, we're not going to fix people. We're not going to fix, all of the psychological things that lead people to believe nonsense like the Earth is flat, or that you could cure cancer by sticking needles in magical points on your body, right? It's amazing how many people believe that, but that's the human condition. The human condition isn't going to change anytime soon. So we're always going to need to have a skeptical movement to be there to bring together this collection of knowledge, right? Okay, so how have we evolved? I anticipate these two. Shifting focus. This is where the next thing I want to go to. So what are the kind of topics that the skeptical movement deals with? This has been a conversation, insider baseball, skeptics talking to each other conversation since I joined the movement in the 90s. The conversation started out as, to what extent should skeptics be addressing religion? And to what extent should they avoid religion? That was pretty much the conversation we were having in the 1990s. And the answer was, if you were primarily an atheist, you thought that that's all we should be doing. And if you were primarily a skeptic, you thought that that's not what we should be doing. And we never, ever resolved that disagreement. We just basically agreed to disagree, and everyone just did what they wanted to do, which is, you could pretty much summarize the skeptical movement in that last phrase, that everybody pretty much just does what they want to do. So it's like often referred to as herding cats, right? Or like we're barely a movement in that there's no organization really. It's just a bunch of people who believe kind of the same thing, doing what they want to do under this fairly broad umbrella of promoting rational thinking and critical thinking, et cetera. But my take has always been it's fine for people to specialize. If you want to primarily focus on religious beliefs, go right ahead. That's great. More power to you. I'm a scientist. I want to focus on science. And if I start coming at people's religious beliefs head on right out of the gate, they're not going to listen to any of the science that I got to teach them. And so it's just not an effective strategy for me. And there's also a pretty clear philosophical dividing lines that you could make, which is very helpful as well, to know where your borders are so that you could be internally consistent. I still get emails about this. This debate has never gone away. I don't think it's ever going to go away within the broader rationalist movement. To what should our attitude be towards religion? But the focus has actually shifted. And what do you think it's shifted to? Anyone want to shout out the answer? It's shifted to politics. The question now is, to what extent should we be engaged with politics? And the answer is the same. Do whatever you want to do. I really don't care. But don't tell other people what they should be doing, because there isn't one approach here, and nobody has the answer to how we should be promoting rationalism. So, and I think also the answer is remarkably similar too, in that they're both the wrong questions, right? Should we address religion or should we address politics is actually, they're both wrong in the same way. With the religion question, the real question is, should we address faith, not religion? And we don't really try to debunk faith itself. What we try to do is to define it, so people understand where it fits into human thinking. Faith is not science. It's outside the realm of science. It by definition is believing something without empirical evidence. It's not an empirical view of the world, by definition. But there are certain rules, intellectual rules, and even societal rules that come along with that. If you say that you believe something by faith, you could no longer claim it's science. If you believe something by faith, you could no longer impose that upon other people in your society without violating the separation of church and state, without violating personal religious liberty. So that's sort of that's the battle line I think we should be laying down. You could believe whatever you want, but you cannot cross this line into separation of church and state or into infiltrating science, etc. And we deal with religious issues all the time. My entry into skepticism was over the creationism issue. We deal with religious issues. It's not the religion that we don't deal with, it's the faith. If you believe something by faith, then by definition you're not believing with it by science. But if you're saying the science of evolution is wrong and creationism correct, now you're speaking my language, right? Now you're making a scientific or a philosophical argument, and that is totally fair game now. But once you retreat to, this is a personal choice of pure faith, okay, good for you. Well, there's nothing to say about that. You've retreated beyond all science and reason by definition. Same thing with politics. We deal with political issues. And I think we were mistaken. I think early on we said we're a non-political, we are non-political. That was just a bad choice of words. We're non-partisan is what we meant. And I think we're getting better at saying that now. It's like we don't promote any particular political label or ideology, but we deal with political issues every day. And that in fact, the kinds of problems that we're dealing with has been slowly shifting over to more and more political issues over the last 10 or so years, because that's where the game is, right? That's where the energy is. That's where the money is. So not the real money. That's the figurative money. So for example, vaccines, right? So there's and also this is another sort of shifting focus. So pseudoscience has, I think, been eclipsed a lot by science denial. Science denial has definitely been on the rise in the last 10 years. And we've shifted from kind of fringe paranormal issues to pretty mainstream political issues. So we will spend far more of our time as a movement now talking about global warming denial and anti-GMO pseudoscience and vaccine refusal and alternative medicine pseudoscience. Alternative medicine kind of always been there, but the other three are definitely rising in prominence in terms of what we focus on. And we spend less of our time talking about, the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and the Bermuda Triangle and aliens, right? We still talk about that sometimes. It's important because people believe that Bigfoot exists for a number of reasons, and if we can focus on that, if I could explain to somebody why their belief in Bigfoot's wrong, I could explain a lot of science to them and a lot of critical thinking to them. So it's a good topic to cut your teeth on. It's a good topic that's kind of low stakes, where we could get people to sort of buy into the scientific skepticism. And then, once we get them to understand why, that probably a flying saucer didn't crash in Roswell, then we could talk about their closely held political views, right? We could get there eventually. But you might not want to hit them over the head with that right out of the gate, because they might not be open to your message. And then so like, for example, just as a podcast, all right, so this is the last thing that I'm going to say. I have 14 minutes left, and then I'm going to take questions. So you guys could start queuing up if you want to do questions. And then right before the questions, I'm going to do all my shameless plugging. So while you guys are queuing up, I'll finish this thought, I'll do some shameless plugging, and then I'll start to go to questions. For example, on the podcast, we get emails from people who started in very different places when they started listening to our show, and then ended up being, skeptics. And oftentimes, what made them a skeptic was not the topic they were interested in, it was the topic they weren't interested in, right? So if they were creationists, we made them skeptics by talking about Roswell, right? Not by talking about creationism. If they're, a global warming denier, we made them skeptics by talking about GMOs, because that's something that they're kind of on board on already, right? If you understand why people could be wrong about that, and then you apply it to what you believe, right? That pathway seems to be a viable one, rather than hitting somebody over the head with their core belief out of the gate. So that's just something to keep in mind. I think as a movement, that's why we focus on so many different things, including it's still important. We still have to talk about it when somebody says they have DNA evidence of Bigfoot. We got to talk about that, even though, that's not the most important issue facing the world today. But it is really important for teaching science and critical thinking, and it's fun. And just like we're at DragonCon, because it's fun. And this is going to get us in front of people who maybe wouldn't ordinarily think about science and skepticism and critical thinking. And if I can eventually get into a conversation with them about GMOs, right, or whatever, that's great. That's fantastic. So I think that we are in a good place with the skeptical movement. Where do we go from here? I don't know. I don't know where we go from here. 5 years ago, I didn't know where to go from there. 10 years ago, I didn't know. Looking back, I had no idea every step of the way. I just didn't. I think that we have to just constantly be looking forward and adapting to what's happening, and also trying to get one step ahead when we can, collectively and individually. I think we're doing pretty good at that, but it's a moving target. And we are way overmatched in terms of resources. But we are, as Richard Wiseman said this to me a number of years ago, and I think he was right. He said, the skeptical movement is punching way above its weight. If you think what we're up against and how we're doing, we're holding our own against multiple heavyweights, and we're kicking ass. Our work is not done. It's never going to be done. And where are we going to be in 5 years? Who the hell knows what the hell is what's going to be going on in the world in 5 or 10 years? Again, I didn't anticipate the flat earth thing. I didn't anticipate the GMO thing. I didn't anticipate the anti-vaccine thing. These things all happened, and I had to respond to them and respond quickly. So I think the future is we have to keep our eyes open. We have to talk to each other. We have to be nimble, and just keep plugging away. All right, thank you guys. I'll be happy to take some questions. Wait, shameless plugging first. So I will be on the Apocalypse panel later today. Tomorrow at 7 o'clock, at 7 p.m., the other rogues and I will be talking about critical thinking and scientific skepticism. We're not going to just go over our book. It's sort of inspired by the book, but we will be talking about a lot of that and maybe extending beyond our book, The Skeptics Guide to the Universe. We're going to teach you how to know what's really real. That's what we're going to do. And then after that, tomorrow at 8 o'clock is the SGU private show. Anybody who wants tickets to the SGU private show, just go onto our website. You'll see how to get that. And if you are having trouble, just see one of us and we'll help you out. All right, thank you. I'll take the first question.
What do you feel is the number one challenge that faces individual skeptics, and how can we overcome that obstacle?
So as an individual, I think that your personal journey always has to be first and foremost, right? It's a lot of information. It's a lot of stuff. So there is knowledge about psychology, there's knowledge about the scientific method, about philosophy, and then you have to have, working knowledge, not expertise, but working knowledge in each individual area and each individual topic. It's a ton of work. Nobody can do it. Nobody can master it all. But so one, I would say, is just continue the journey, just continue reading, learning as much as you can, and have some kind of appreciation of how deep a pool you're swimming in. And two is be humble, man. Don't, because it's, you have to avoid, this again came up on the last panel, and I totally agree. One of the things, I've become more and more humble over my career. I think that's critically important. You have to have the principle of charity. Don't make assumptions about what other people are saying or about what other people believe. Follow the principle of charity, where you give them the most charitable interpretation of their position. And two is just be humble in your own knowledge, because we're overwhelmed by information. That's just a fact. We're all just struggling to make the best sense of it that we can, and just try to appreciate where you are on that journey. And that helps, to me, that helps take this nurturing approach. We're all on this journey together. Some people are, maybe they're going the wrong direction, but there's no place, there's no functional, useful place for being judgmental. Is much more about something that you know than somebody else. The real knowledge dwarfs the difference between you and that other person. And you have to consider every other topic in the world that you're probably phenomenally ignorant about. And just, if we just help nurture each other along our path towards knowledge and critical thinking, then I think that will lead us to the best place. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for coming. I'm not allowed to touch this. Okay. So I know you had a similar problem that we had in one of our hospitals where chiropractors were trying to get credentialing. Mm-hmm. You were successful in blocking your chiropractors, and we were not. So would you please talk about that? Because it's one thing that one person can do.
Yeah. So that's also this never-ending challenge. You're kind of always, it's your finger in the dike. You're holding it off for now. So you have to, first of all, know what your message is. You have to know who you're talking to, and you have to be able to communicate to them the thing that they need to know. Like, so in my particular case, one of the challenges was teaching our students naturopathy, right? Which is pretty much pure pseudoscience from beginning to end. And they were just completely hoodwinked. Nobody who was involved in that decision prior to me getting involved had the particular expertise to know what was actually going on. They were experts in their medical field, like a cardiologist was an expert in cardiology, knew absolutely nothing about cardiology pseudoscience. Nothing about it. And so they were not able to deal with it. And so I was able to communicate to them what was going on, and then I was also able to communicate to the dean what was going on in a way that they at least said, okay, we at least need to rethink this. Like, this cannot go forward as is. But again, the promoters of pseudoscience and nonsense are relentless. Because again, this is their job. This is their livelihood. They're never going to stop. So you have to be vigilant. You have to be vigilant in that. So vigilance is like, how do you make a successful podcast? You show up every week. That's like number one, right? You just show up every week is like 99% of the battle. How do we fight pseudoscience? Vigilance is 99% of the battle. Yeah.
You brought up a subject just then that I wasn't going to talk about. I use chiropractors, and they work for me. I use them only to snap my back and make me feel better, not to cure the flu or keep me from getting cancer or pregnant. So having said that, I'm not here to question you. I want to change your views on fake news.
Change my view on fake news.
Yes, sir.
Do it. While you're walking up here, let me tell you, so chiropractors do provide, if they do manipulation, then they'll relax your muscles. You'll feel better for a time. Is it better than anything else? No, there's no evidence that it's better than going to a physical therapist. There's no evidence, in fact, that it's better than handing somebody a pamphlet that tells them how to take care of their back. But then again, nothing that anybody does is better than that. Treating uncomplicated chronic back pain is all about exercise and self-care. That's what it is. Unless you have a complication, you need surgery or you have a pinched nerve or whatever. Chiropractors don't even deal with that. You have to rule out all the things that requires anything other than just exercise first, and then they'll basically do some physical therapy, and then everything else is pretty much BS that they do. So the problem is not that they do some physical therapy for lower back pain or whatever. It's all the pseudoscience that rides in behind it, which is very variable based upon the chiropractor, right? There are 2% or so that are pretty science-based, and they're reasonable. And then there's 30% that are pure pseudoscience, and then there's 70% that are some mix in between. And we literally call them mixers because they do a lot of everything. Go ahead.
Okay. Stage fright, so I'm not sure I'm going to get this out right. I liked what I've heard, especially the term critical thinking and how that needs to be pushed. The thing I didn't hear was the point that lack of evidence for something is not the same as evidence against something. So, for example, if I think back several hundred years, there was no evidence really for electricity like we use it today, but it was still there.
Right.
And we couldn't, but nobody ever thought about it, so it wasn't an issue then. But nevertheless, we couldn't have disproved, because we just didn't have the way of proving anything. So some of these things you talked about, I wonder if they're not in the same category. Things like acupuncture, ghosts, whatever. We're just not in a position to be able to provide evidence against.
So that's where specialized knowledge is important. Like for acupuncture, for example, there have been over 3,000 studies of acupuncture. So there isn't a lack of evidence. There's evidence for lack of efficacy. Those are two different things. We have evidence that acupuncture doesn't work. We also have evidence that acupuncture points don't exist, which is kind of a critical thing when you're making a claim for acupuncture. We also have evidence that qi doesn't exist. And so if you're using acupuncture points to manipulate qi, and qi doesn't exist, and acupuncture points don't exist, and the clinical evidence shows that acupuncture doesn't work, we could pretty confidently conclude that acupuncture doesn't work. That's different than ghosts, because ghosts are not physical. And so then you have to say, well, what's your actual claim? So you have to posit a testable claim. Has that claim been tested? Are you saying ghosts emit electromagnetic radiation? We can test that. Guess what? There's no evidence that happens. If you're saying, well, ghosts are this unfalsifiable thing okay, in that case, you've just removed yourself from the arena of science, you've stepped into the realm of faith, and now you believe in ghosts as a matter of faith. Good luck to you, but there's no longer any way to scientifically investigate it. So, just to wrap all that up, what you're basically saying is you have to understand the philosophical underpinnings of science, and you have to know how they relate to the specific claims that are being made. Because yes, lack of evidence is not the same as evidence for absence, although you can infer the absence from a lack of evidence. Depends on how much you've looked, how well you've looked, and whether or not you would expect to have seen evidence based upon the research that you have done. So it's a more nuanced approach to that. It's not sort of black and white. And you can't make the argument from ignorance that it exists because we don't know that it doesn't exist. All you could say is, well, we don't know. And again, that gets to the critical thinking component of everything. Last question.
I was wondering what skeptics are doing in what I think of as the marketplace of ideas. An example I would think of it, I see somebody join a church and it actually looks like a rational decision because they get a lot of extras. They get a place, a community, they might get childcare, they might get, it's a place where people can meet on topics that don't have anything to do with it. So I don't know how far, that's what they're competing against.
Yeah, I agree, and that's basically the role of the humanist organization. Humanists are trying to deliberately fill that exact role with a secular church, essentially. They don't like that term, but that's basically what it is. It's just basically secularism, but with a community, and that you can get together, but there's no, they just factor out all of the religion and the hocus pocus, which is actually evidence-based as well, because people, there is evidence that religion, being part of a religious community actually correlates with better health long-term. Sure it does, because you're plugged into a community. When something happens, there's a support structure. It's more of a generic effect of having a social support structure. So let's provide a social support structure for people who are secular, without bringing them into a particular faith or promoting a particular faith. So I agree, and I think that we do have to think also about what's the community aspect of skepticism that may be not our strong point, but it is an important part for the human condition. All right, everyone, thank you so much.